Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK Regional Finals Round 1 overview and analysis video. Excited to get into this. We know our first two teams that are going to be going to Worlds representing the LCK here in their home country of South Korea. Of course, that being our champion Gen.g and our runner-up T1 with the most amount of championship points. And so those are going to be your first two teams qualifying, but throughout the rest of this season, this regional finals, if you will, we're going to determine the other two teams that are going to qualify for that World Championship. So a lot of really interesting matchups. Of course, a lot of really good teams still in this tournament. The #1 seed in the regular season in the summer splits in this tournament. A couple of world champions are in this tournament. Last year's world champions are in this tournament. A lot of really interesting storylines, but let me know what you guys were expecting from the series down in the comments section below. Of course, today we're going to be covering the two round 1 series, so the series between the #3 and #4 seeds to determine the #3 seed at Worlds, and the series between the #5 and the #6 seeds to see who will play the team that ends up losing that first series for a shot at the 4th seed. So a lot of interesting scenarios, a lot of interesting things, but I would love to know what you guys thought of all of these games, of all of these teams, down in the comments section below. Of course, I love to hear you guys' feedback, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything up in a nice little bow. Of course, I will also give a small preview for what I expect to happen in the final series of the LCK season, but most of the time in this video, most of the analysis is going to be spent on the two series that we saw in the previous couple of days. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Incredibly excited to get into it, and that means we get to kick it off with our #3 versus #4 matchup. The winner of this series will be heading to the 2023 World Championships. So a lot on the line for these teams and for these orgs, and it's certainly an intriguing matchup between the #3 seeded KT Rolster and the #4 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Very interesting to see these two teams here, because I think both of them have taken actually relatively similar paths to get to this location. Now, I do think one of them has been significantly better than the other over the course of the last few months, and we'll definitely talk about that. It's certainly not an uncommon opinion to hold, but, you know, they both kind of have similar arcs, I would say. Both of them really struggled at the beginning of the year, or at least struggled more than I think people anticipated. I was a little bit lower on KT at the beginning of the year. I wasn't necessarily sure what you were going to get out of players like BDD and Cuz, and I really wasn't sold on the bot lane of Aiming and Lehens being very synergistic. I like them both individually as players, but I wasn't sure how they were going to work together, of course. Couple of these players coming off of bad years, but they have just grown and gotten better game after game after game. They got 3rd in the spring split, and it looked like, okay, this team is kind of on the rise, and then they really exploded in the summer split. They were the #1 seed coming out of the regular season. They went 17-1 in the regular season, so they looked pretty unstoppable, pretty dominant, but things didn't necessarily go their way. T1 got back on track and ended up beating them twice in the playoffs to send them down here, and they got 3rd place again, which I think they would consider a disappointment, but it really does feel like they are a part of kind of the big 3 in the LCK at the moment. And Hanwha is not a part of that, or at least that's not what you would anticipate them to be a part of. They were a pretty high seed, the #3 seed going into playoffs, but, you know, again, a lot of underperformances. This team just has not felt like they are on top of the LCK, right? There does feel like pretty distinguished tiers in the LCK, and Hanwha feels like a B-tier team, honestly, and that's an unfortunate thing to say for a team that has a ton of really good talent on them, but I really do think this is another org and another team that has gotten better over the course of this year, obviously with Clid having all the problems, Grizzly coming in and you know, entering that jungle position and really unlocking a lot of what this team does, I think has really helped them out a ton. I think Grizzly and Zeka in particular have really good chemistry, and I think that, you know, when those two are playing well, that's kind of the key to Hanwha's success. I've harped on it a lot on this channel, but of course, Viper is always going to be a big focal point for basically everybody trying to analyze Hanwha Life for good reason. He's the best player on this team, but as I've said before, really their ups and downs and their positives and negatives run through this jungle mid. Viper is going to play well, but Viper's also not really been able to 1v9 against a lot of other teams in the LCK this year. If Grizzly and Zeka can have good games and a good series, then honestly, Hanwha can beat KT Rolster. It really is a lot on the performance of those players, Grizzly in particular in that jungle matchup, but KT has been so consistent. It's just really hard to predict that they're not going to just be the better team in a series like this, because they honestly should be. They should be the better team. They've been the better team all year long. They destroy destroyed Hanwha Life in the playoffs to get into that semifinals, and so, you know, I think KT definitely has a lot of momentum on their side, but are they going to be able to carry that in? Well, we're going to find out because, of course, we go game by game, and that means we get to start it off with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was KT Rolster. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Not a big surprise here. This is kind of, I think, what we all expected. I think we all thought KT was at the very least going to be able to generate some early momentum. They had a lot of the confidence, again, from beating Hanwha in the summer playoffs going into this series, and that absolutely came to fruition in this first game. This was pretty clinical from them. Honestly, not really a lot of bad things to say about KT. There are some good things to say about Hanwha. I'm not going to pretend like every single player on that team ended up playing awfully, but I think the major mistakes were just the fact that KT was a little bit more active on the map. Hanwha wasn't nearly as aggressive in the early game, and I think that did end up being a problem, especially when you draft something like a Taliyah. You need to be moving around the map because you're going to get outscaled into like a Azir Kai'Sa, even with Aphelios and Viego and even the Gragas, right? You have options in the late game, but I still think that you needed to make some plays. You needed to get the Taliyah moving around the map, and while Zeka, I think, was very active, I just don't think it was enough to be able to carry the rest of the team, who was very passive, quite frankly. And I think for KT on the other side, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They knew what their win condition was. You've got Nazir, you've got a Kai'Sa, you've got multiple ways. If you get one of these carries online, it's going to be very difficult for Hanwha Life to actually be able to stop you, especially if your AD carry ends up getting super fed, because they just don't have the range to be able to deal with Kai'Sa. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Aiming got super online in this game. The Kai'Sa became a massive problem, and really, Hanwha did not have a clean answer. They didn't really have an answer at all, if we're being entirely honest, and I think that became a major problem for them throughout the rest of this game. Player of the game for me pretty easily is going to go to Aiming in the bot lane. Actually really liked how he played this. He was not, you know, super aggressive in terms of how he played the Kai'Sa, and I think that's where a lot of people run into problems with Kai'Sa in this current meta. As much as Kai'Sa is a really strong pick, probably the best AD carry in the entire game, best marksman, I should say. I shouldn't even say AD carry because that's not even necessarily accurate, but the best marksman in the entire game at the current moment. It's not because her ultimate can let her dive in and, you know, blow people up and let her play on the edge of danger like Kai'Sa likes to do at a lot of times when she's in meta. It's because she's a really good artillery mage with those W's right now. That's really kind of the main draw of what Kai'Sa offers, and I think a lot of times people get sucked into the idea that you need to go in on Kai'Sa, and a lot of times that ends up being their downfall. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of opportunities for you to still be able to completely take over fights by ulting into the backline, doing a lot of damage, positioning really well. Like, it's certainly not a bad idea if you can pull it off, and especially if you use it at the right time, it can be a really big positive. But what Kai'Sa really does, and what helps her take over games right now, is that W, and being this long-range artillery mage, and that's exactly what Aiming was this game. Really good stuff from him, but he had a lot of assistance, he had a lot of help from the rest of the team to be able to enable that damage, especially to get him going, because Kai'Sa can take some time to get online. Thought Lehens had a really good game on the Leona. Lehens is fantastic. He was the best player on KT Rolster in the regular season. He earned MVP on the broadcast, which I can't even really argue with. I gave mine to Pays, but Lehens was my runner-up. I think it really should have gone to one of those two players, and Lehens getting it is certainly not a frustrating thing for me. He was awesome in the summer split, and he was really good again in this game on the Leona. I'm not a huge fan of this pick. I think generally speaking, it's just a little bit worse than some of the other like big engaged supports like Nautilus and Rel, but I do think Leona still has a lot of value. I mean, a ton of CC is still valuable. Basically, no matter what happens, she's just not very tanky at the current moment in comparison to a lot of those other picks, but if you can get a lot of the CC off and lock down the important targets, then it doesn't really matter. Keen was awesome this game on the Cassante. He's the other player that I really want to shout out. Keen obviously has been really good for KT, probably the best top laner in the LCK. Him and Doran are definitely kind of trading that back and forth throughout this split, but Keen was solid. Cuz was good, BDD was good. Everybody on KT just kind of did their thing. I think Aiming was definitely the carry, and he's going to get player of the game for it, but Lehens and Keen definitely deserve some shouts, and Cuz and BDD weren't awful this game, and so, you know, positives to KT, a pretty standard win for them. And then for Hanwha on the other side, you had some good. I certainly don't want to pretend like it was all bad. I think Zeka actually had a really good game. He was doing so much damage on Taliyah. You don't necessarily associate that pick with, like, carry levels of damage, but Zeka was doing carry levels of damage on the Taliyah. Really, really good stuff from him. I think if he had a little bit more support around him, that could have been good. I think Zeka was easily the best performing member on Hanwha Life in game number 1. Viper certainly didn't make any major errors, and he was dealing damage in the late game team fights, but again, I don't think he was nearly aggressive enough. The game just got way too out of control in the mid game. I think if Hanwha in general was pushing forward and trying to find a few more skirmishes, especially with the Taliyah that was doing so much damage, I think you were actually in an okay spot to be able to try and get that done. The problem was I just don't think that they actually tried. So Zeka and Viper kind of doing their thing, but everybody else was just kind of meh. Grizzly was meh. Life was meh. You know, the scoreline looks pretty bad, but Life really wasn't a disaster in this game, but who was a disaster was Kingen in the top lane, who's going to get my dud of the game. I just didn't like what he was doing. I don't necessarily think this is the worst dud of the game I've ever given out. He didn't completely throw the game single-handedly, but Keen was so much more valuable towards the back half, and if you're going to pick something like Gragas, you need to be able to kind of perform in some of these fights to set up the Talia, to set up the Viego, to set up the Aphelios. And it never really felt like the Gragas was all that relevant, and I think that was a major problem for Hanwha. Just in general, it felt like they were outclassed this game. It didn't really feel like Hanwha felt comfortable playing into KT Rolster, and that was a very similar feeling to what we got in the playoffs as well. And so if that's going to continue, if that's going to permeate throughout the rest of this series, I'm not exactly sure where Hanwha's going to stand. But of course, it's just game one. You're not going to worry too much. You can still bounce back. You can still get back in this series, but they're going to have to do it now. You certainly don't want to drop 2-0 to KT Rolster. That is going to be a really, really hard spot to be able to come back from. Winning 3 games in a row against this team is not easy. Ask basically anybody else in the entire league. So pretty big game for Hanwha here. Are they going to be able to tie the series up, or is KT Rolster going to take a dominating lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And this is a bad place to be if you are Hanwha Life Esports. You don't want to fall to 0-2 against KT. That's certainly not what you wanted to do. But again, I think a lot of the flaws that we knew that KT had are kind of getting exploited. Now, it wasn't nearly as bad here in game 2. This actually was a pretty close game for a little while. I say close. KT definitely had a lot of momentum in this game. They were getting all the things that really mattered, all of the objectives, a lot of the tempo in the game. But Hanwha wasn't dying, right? Like, around the 20-minute mark, this game was relatively similar in terms of, you know, gold and power structure. The problem was that Hanwha was never going to be able to team fight against this KT team with their current setup, having not been able to generate that big of a lead in the mid game. It was going to be a problem. You were relying way too much on Viper, and as we've seen in basically every game that they've played throughout this year, Viper cannot be the only player on this team to carry the game. It just doesn't work for them. It's not a style that they are particularly good at executing on, and so they weren't able to get it back. But KT, I think, did everything that they were supposed to. They drafted a very stable comp with a couple of interesting pieces here and there, and they definitely took a little bit of a risk having a weaker early game, but I think it ended up paying off because they knew they were the better team. Player of the game is once again going to go to Aiming in the bot lane. He has been spectacular through the first 2 games. Now, I don't want to hype him up too much, not because I dislike Aiming, but rather because I think Kai'Sa is just so strong, right? Kai'Sa as a champion does so much that, yes, Aiming did the most damage in the game in both games. Yes, Aiming was kind of the carry for KT Rolster in both games, but you know, I don't want to sit here and say that, like, you know, I want to make it clear, Kai'Sa is very, very strong. That being said, what KT has really done a lot of a better job at over the course of the last month or so, and I've talked about this a bit on the channel, is actually playing towards Aiming and playing towards this bot lane win condition. It was something they really didn't do at all in spring, and then over the course of summer, I think they started to increase that more and more and more. BDD was like such a win condition for them throughout the entirety of the year. Keen has been such a big win condition. Lehen's moving around the map has been such a big win condition, but I think KT realized to be a more complete team, they wanted to learn at the very least how to play through bot lane, and I think Aiming has looked a lot better because of it. And of course, Aiming's a really good player. He was really good on weak side as well. I'm not trying to take anything away from Aiming. He's really solid, and he's actually been able to go toe-to-toe with Viper, and maybe even outplay him in this series, which is super good. Aiming's explosion has absolutely continued. We talked about Aiming in 2022 as a player that, you know, had the best year of his career by a gigantic margin, a veteran, somebody who had been around the block for multiple different teams that had never really stood out in specific areas, but really looked fantastic last year, and I didn't know if that was going to continue. Well, it absolutely has. Aiming is the real deal, and I think we see that now when he is surrounded by genuine talent that wants to play into him. But rest of the team was also really good. Really like what Cuz was able to do. One of the big things that I think has been Cuz's priority has been to pick champions that do really well into Grizzly in particular. So if Grizzly's going to pick something like Vi early, then I think Cuz is going to be very happy to pick up the Poppy. I think that's just generally going to be a strategy. I think they recognize, in the same way that I do, that getting Grizzly behind is a death sentence to Hanwha Life. They have no idea how to play without jungle pressure. It was something they struggled with even before Grizzly was in the lineup, but something that they have continued to really struggle with Grizzly in the lineup. When they don't have jungle pressure, they have no idea how to play the mid game, and I think that continued to be the case. So Cuz did some good work this game. No real major errors from the rest of the team. Keen, BDD, Lehens, they were all really good. They all did their jobs. Keen pulling out the Malphite. Really haven't seen it in quite a while. It still is meta. It still is good. It's definitely still going to be good. If Zeri is going to increase in priority, then I can see more Malphite. But, you know, I still think it's definitely pickable, even into something like Cassante, which I think some people don't like nearly as much. But I think, generally speaking, KT was solid this game. And then for Hanwha on the other side, again, your weaknesses are getting really exploited in this series up until this point. The things that I pointed out that this team really did struggle quite a bit with are are becoming problems for them, and they're continuing to be problems. Done of the game is going to go to Grizzly, and again, this is exactly what I was saying in the playoffs, before the playoffs, in the primer. When Grizzly doesn't have a good game, Hanwha Life, like, almost 100% of the time loses. It is almost completely irrelevant how the rest of the team plays. Grizzly is so important towards what HLE wants to do, which is why I praised him so much in the regular season when this team was going on a win streak, because his early games mattered so much towards their success. But I think when he struggles, like he is right now in this particular series, and like he has in the past couple of weeks, I just don't know if Hanwha's going to be able to play around that. I think Viper was fine this game. He certainly wasn't perfect, and I think Life definitely had some good moments on the Blitzcrank. You can create a lot of action with that, and I think that kept the game close. Really dissuaded KT from trying to take these big advantageous trades in the mid game. They wanted to look for these 5v5s. And I think that ended up being the way that the game went. I thought Kingen had a much better game here in Game 2, this time playing the Cassante, but it just wasn't enough. Grizzly was really bad on the Vi, basically getting nothing done in the early game, getting outscaled, and then just becoming useless in the late game. If you don't have, gold on Vi, she's going to be super squishy, and Azir and Kaisa and, even a Malphite, like, they're going to be able to kill her very, very quickly, and then all of a sudden now, look at the rest of this comp. You don't really have good backline access, which is a problem. Zeka was also worse than he was in game number 1, which I do think is a bit of a problem, but expecting Zeka to do all of the heavy lifting, I think, isn't particularly good. These two kind of feed off of each other in that way. When Grizzly plays well, Zeka plays well. When Grizzly plays poorly, Zeka tends to play poorly. It just kind of is how it is. So for Hanwha, you're now down 0-2. Game 3, obviously super important. You don't want to go down in a sweep. You don't want to get swept twice in a row by KT Rolster and have that be the way that you go into that next series. That would be a disaster. But to even keep this series alive, you've got to win Game 3, but all the confidence is in favor of KT right now. Are they going to be able to close it out in another clean sweep, or is HLE going to be able to pick up their first win all year long against KT? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. HLE is going to be able to pick up the win here in Game 3. They're going to keep this series alive, going 2-1 so far, and obviously this was a must-win for them. You don't want to go down 3-0. You certainly do not want to get swept by a team that has already swept you just like a week ago or whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, however long ago. These two teams faced off against each other in the summer playoffs, but Hanwha still had some problems in this game. I know it looks on paper like they kind of dominated it, and I do think that they had tempo and control for basically the whole game, but a lot of the problems and a lot of the things that I was worried about definitely still, kind of bled through and seeped through. I just think there was enough good in this game to be able to overcome it. KT felt a little bit off. It felt like they had a lot of advantages in this game that they just didn't really want to take advantage of. I don't like either team's draft, and I don't think that really helped either team necessarily, but we'll kind of get into that as we go throughout the game a little bit more. Let's, of course, start off with my player of the game, and that's going to go to Life on Hanwha Life Esports. Playing the Braum here in the support position. Braum is a generally good pick, I would say, something that I have been very positive on and very positive about over the past couple of weeks, because I just think that Braum is really consistent. I think he does everything that you want him to do, and if you have a good support, he can really, actually, genuinely do it all. He can engage with ultimate, or at least set up for really good engage with this ultimate, and he really needed to do that in this game, because look at the rest of this comp. You're really relying a lot on Gnar and Azir ult after that, and so you really need to make sure that the Braum is playing well, but most importantly, he's gonna probably be the best peel in the entire game. Him and Nautilus, I think, kind of share that role, but I think Braum does it even more efficiently. That's always going to be what Braum does at an incredibly high level, and it just allows the carries of the team to really play up and play aggressive and try to play faster, and I think in general, that's almost always going to benefit the better team in a game and in a series like this, and so really good stuff from Life. He's been super up and down over the course of this year, mostly down at the beginning of the year, especially spring, where he was kind of a disaster for HLE. He was really bad at the beginning of summer as well, but as the season went on, it felt like he was getting more consistent. Now he was really bad in playoffs as well, so it's good to see him perform well here in the season finals. He's been an interesting addition to this team. I like Life as a player. I think he's been somebody who's been very underrated over the course of his career. He was awesome with aiming for this KT Rolster team last year. That's really where a lot of my optimism came in for him, but it just never really felt like he clicked on this team. And while I don't necessarily think that that has gone away, it's good to see him play well here in Game 3. As for the carries, as for the damage dealers, it was mostly Zeka this game on the Azir. I think he's probably been the best player on the team in this series, or at least probably the most consistent. Him and Life, I think, both have been solid, and Viper really hasn't been bad at all. We'll get to Viper. He was fine in this game too, but Zeka was the one, I think, dealing a lot of the damage in the back half of the game. Azir can just be a major problem. Again, I think when players don't try to do too much on this champion, that champion is just so consistent at what he does. Azir is really strong, and he's really good, and I think we continue to see that in a game like this. Kingen was good, Viper was good, but Grizzly's scoreline I do think is a little bit deceiving. I think Grizzly still had a pretty poor game here in game number 3. I don't like Nocturne. I'm super vocal about that on the channel. I think Nocturne is probably the biggest bait in the meta at the current moment. I just don't think Nocturne really does anything. Like, yes, the ultimate's really good if you have, like, one backline target that you really need to assassinate, but that is becoming more and more rare in the current meta in terms of how comps are assembled, and again, that's kind of the case here. Like, what? You're gonna ult onto the backline and hopefully kill either Tristana or the Nilo, which, by the way, isn't even guaranteed because you've got Cassante, Rel, and Nautilus, which is a ridiculous amount of peel for the Nocturne if he does dive in. But let's say you do kill the Tristana, right? You're probably just trading 1-for-1, and even then, like, is it worth it? Probably not. You know what I mean? You don't really have a ton of tempo in the early game. I just don't think Nocturne is nearly as good as people say he is, and I think Grizzly did struggle a bit in the early game here. He really wasn't all that relevant towards what this team did, so you know, I think the scoreline's fine, but wasn't a huge fan of Grizzly's game. I think in general, this was a lot of, like, Life and Zeka really kind of winning some of the team fights, and King and Viper also playing really well. Again, I don't want to take anything away from them. I'm not trying to undersell what they're doing. I just think this was kind of an okay win. It really wasn't, like, a dominating win that really changed my opinion. And then for KT on the other side, honestly, it's wild to say this because they were so down in gold for a bit of this game, but I always was kind of like, okay, KT's going to come back and win this game, because it really did feel like they were playing like bad, like uncharacteristically bad, and I think that ended up continuing on. They just dug themselves too big of a hole to be able to get themselves out of, but I don't even know if I necessarily think this game is entirely repeatable for them. Dead of the game is going to go to Lehens in the support position. I like Lehens. I've talked about him a ton already in this video, but, you know, the Nautilus wasn't all that good this game. You really need to be mostly peel for this team. You're looking at Rel and Cassante as really big engage threats, and following that up with, like, Neela is very, very dangerous for the enemy team to have to try to play into, but the Nautilus needs to make sure that Trist and Neela can actually get some stuff off, and I think Lehens played really poorly in the mid-game and really allowed a lot of opportunities for HLE to start blowing this game up out of control. Life was just straight up better at his role than Lehens was in this game, and that was a problem. Keen wasn't nearly as effective, I think, on the Cassante as he was in game number 1. BDD wasn't moving around the map like you need to do in the Tristana versus Azir matchup, and, you know, when you get behind on the Rel, it's really not going to be an easy way to play out the endgame if you are Cuz in this instance, because you're just going to go in and get blown out basically immediately. That champion really only does one thing, and that's engage, and so for KT, I'm not going to freak out too much. Again, like I said, I think you could even argue that this game doesn't even feel like it would be repeatable. This honestly just felt like a weird game overall, and while they didn't play exactly well, I'm going to need to see more than just this game before I start to give up on what KT is doing. And the same thing can be said for Hanwha, but I need to see more than just this game before I believe they can stay in this series. Obviously, one win is really nice, but this was a very, very weird game, and I still don't think their macro is very good, if I'm being entirely honest, and so they're going to need to prove it to me again here in game number 4. Of course, they need to keep their series alive by winning this, but KT can try and show that game 3 was a little bit of a fluke by ending it here. So are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to close out this series with a 3-1 series win. And they got it done. They got the job done. Pardon if I'm not particularly enthusiastic or incredibly excited about the outcome. First of all, it was entirely anticipated. This isn't surprising anybody. KT was absolutely the favorite coming into the series. They obliterated Hanwha Life last time they played, and there was really no reason to believe that anything was going to change unless some magic, like, King and Zeka Worlds mojo ends up, you know, turning the tide, and that didn't happen here. But even just in the context of this series, like, as much as I'm excited for KT going to Worlds, the series was so boring. Like, it was so many boring games. 4 really boring games. Back to back to back to back. And I guess that's just how it goes sometimes in League of Legends, but here we are. Congratulations to KT Rolster. They are officially now going to be the number 3 seed going to Worlds from the LCK in Korea. Obviously, a lot of people are very quick to point out what KT did at Worlds last time it was in Korea, which was obviously 2018. They went out in the quarterfinals to eventual world champions Invictus Gaming in what a lot of people consider to be maybe the greatest series of all time, the greatest best of 5 in League of Legends history. We're going to see if they're going to be able to do anything similar here, going as the number 1 seed last time, the number 3 seed now. Obviously, they've earned it. We all kind of knew that they were going to be coming out of this tournament as one of the representatives. They were easily the best of the 4 teams left. I think in a lot of people's minds, mine included. Just going to be interesting to see what they can do internationally. They stumbled a bit down the stretch, but maybe they have a lot of talent. They have a lot of upside in order to get to, I don't know, top 4, top 2, top 1. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Obviously, we're not going to talk entirely about Worlds, but good for KT. And Hanwha Life losing this series now does move down into that final matchup. They're going to play the winner of whoever wins the second series that we're going to talk about later in this video, but they didn't look good in this series. I don't have a lot of confidence in Hanwha Life at the current moment, obviously. They looked very good before playoffs started, and they obliterated a team like DRX in the first round of the playoffs. That just wasn't on their level, but confidence is probably at an all-time low for this roster at the current moment. It's going to be interesting to see how they adapt. But let's talk about this game very quickly. Wasn't a ton of actual action to talk about, really not a lot of interestingness in this game. Player of the game for me is going to go to BDD. He was really good on the Azir. I think Azir in general was really strong in this series. We've seen a couple of series across the world where Azir has kind of been a bait pick because players just play too aggressive on it and they put themselves in negative positions in order to try to get flashy plays. But I think good mid laners that know what to do on Azir, like BDD, you know, a signature champion, I think obviously still pilots it at a very high level, and BDD was fantastic in this game and in this series. Player of the series for me, though, is going to go to Aiming in the bot lane. I thought he was the most important player towards what KT was doing. The 2 Kaisa games obviously are going to come to a lot of people's minds, but he was still really good on Ezreal here in game number 4, and if Aiming can step up, then obviously that's going to be a massive deal for KT. I think ADC in the current meta is arguably the most important position in the game. I think that, you know, jungle mid is still very, very strong, but however you want to identify it, I think ADC can be really, really vital if you're able to play through them, or if they're also really good on weak side, and Aiming is in probably the best form he's been in all year long at this moment. Now, the team hasn't exactly been in their best form, but I think Aiming has really stepped up and is starting to play as, like, the big carry for this team, which is obviously a very, very big deal, and I think if he's going to continue to be a major positive, then KT's going to have a much easier time. Lehens was solid on the Leona. Cuz and Keen were both good, specifically Cuz in this series, and I think in general, KT was just able to get the job done by being the better macro team, which they were against basically everybody else in the LCK in the regular season, and then having some carries that were able to step up and really carry the game. So good stuff for KT. And then for Hanwha, like I said, kind of a brutal series here, just not a very good one. You were super passive, like anti-proactive, if that's how you want to put it. Very, very boring, which, look at this comp, dude. You're playing Rel, Yone. Like, how do you play slow? How do you play slow with these champions? It's crazy to me, but they were not very good in this series. Life is going to get my dead of the game in game number 4. Not a particularly great Nautilus performance. I think a lot of the positives that I gave him in game number 3 weren't there in game 4, but I think the entire team really played kind of poorly. I thought Kingen did a really good job of trying to do some early damage on the Rumble, but he also messed up some pretty integral combos towards the back half of the game, and Grizzly and Zeka were absolutely nowhere to be found. AFK farming on Rel is a major problem. Like, that is like, I don't know if you're just mental boomed or if you just don't know how to play the champion, but AFK farming on Rel is not good. Like, you shouldn't do that. I don't know what Grizzly's plan was. Zeka, you know, he was fine this series. I think people are going to criticize him more than he deserves for his performance in this series. He was still pretty fine. Viper was really, really irrelevant, and that's fine. Like, he's allowed to be irrelevant. We've already, you know, I've talked about him. He's in the exact same spot that I've said he's been in all year long. I don't know if it's just because he's mental boomed or if he's just not trying as hard or whatever reason you want to give for Viper, but he's really not carrying games for this team. It really is up to a lot of the other players to win, and Viper's just going to be fine every game, which is fine. Like, this team can win with that, but it's worth pointing out that that definitely continued in a series like this. But in general, I lost a lot of confidence in Hanwha Life from this series, not because they got blown out by KT, but because of the way they got blown out by KT. It just didn't feel like they were here mentally, and that worries me going into a series where they're going to have to play for their World's life and their 2023 life. It's going to be interesting to see if they can kind of recoup and rebound and get themselves in a better spot before that series, but congratulations to KT Rolster. They are going to be that third team joining Gen.g and T1 from the LCK at the World Championships. Only one spot left to grab, and KT absolutely, like I said, has earned it. A lot of these players have been best in role in the LCK this year, which is certainly not an easy thing to accomplish. They were the best team in the regular season. While they weren't able to get the job done in the playoffs, they pretty much coasted to this number 3 seed here in the season finals, and I'm really excited to see what this group and collection of players can do internationally. All right, but now that we have gotten our first series of the round number 1 out of the way, it's time to jump into our second series. And obviously, the first series had a lot of stakes. You know, one of the teams was going to qualify for Worlds, which is a big deal, but losing wasn't exactly the worst thing in the world because they would survive. That is not going to be the case for this series that we are going to be talking about. One of these teams will have their 2023 season ended in this series, and the other will move on to face Hanwha Life Esports for that final World spot. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 5 seeded Dplus KIA And the number 6 seeded DRX, a surprising team to be here for sure, considering how their year has gone up until this point, but a lot of things ended up happening down the stretch that ended up getting them into this season finals purely by them making the playoffs and getting blasted by Hanwha Life. So, congratulations to them, but I think a lot of people are looking at this as a pretty big mismatch. Dplus KIA is absolutely the favorite going into this series, and they should be. Honestly, I know that there's been a lot of negativity surrounding this team and surrounding some of these players in recent weeks, and again, I understand it in terms of what they've been able to do in recent weeks. They didn't look very good against T1 in the playoffs, although in hindsight, T1 is obviously a lot better than people were giving them credit for when they were taking down DK, but even in the regular season, this team struggled. They weren't able to get over, like, Hanwha Life, right? They were pretty clearly the 4th best team in the regular season, which typically speaking wouldn't be enough, you know, when T1 starts to emerge to get them into the World Championships. However, I have been saying over and over and over again that this is a narrative that we have seen before from this team and from this org, specifically from Canyon and Showmaker as two players. Look at last year in particular. This has happened in 2019 as well, but I think last year is an even better example of everybody gave up on that team. Specifically, people gave up on Canyon going into the regional qualifier, the season finals last year, and guess what? Canyon turned it on, Showmaker turned it on, they got to Worlds, and they performed really well at Worlds that year, narrowly being taken down by gen.g in the quarterfinals, and so you know, you can never really count these players out. They've always stepped it up when it matters the most. Sometimes they can coast in the regular season, the jungle mid in particular, but they have always found a way to make it worth their while by the time they get to the games that really do matter. Now, for DRX, this team has really struggled over the course of this year. It's a surprise to even see them in this situation, considering they were 6 games under 500 going into the playoffs, and then they got absolutely blasted in the playoffs, but because nobody in the LCK really stepped up as that number 6 seed, I should say, DRX ends up getting the nod. They are definitely major underdogs, but this org has been underdogs before, and they've been able to make it work. I think this team obviously doesn't have nearly the same kind of spark that DRX did last year. I was very much on the DRX train last year. You guys can go and check out my videos. Last year, I predicted them to be getting into the World Championships and to do well at Worlds. I do not have that same kind of confidence in this org this year. I think that this should be a pretty easy series for DK, but we're going to find out right now because, of course, we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0, obviously. This is the circumstance that you want to put yourself in. You want to prove, hey, you know, we're the favorites and we're going to play like the favorites. And this was a dominating game number 1. You can see that from the scoreline. You can see that from basically every bit of information that you have up on your screen right now. A 25-minute win, 15-1, 8 towers to 0, 4 dragons to 0, 1 baron to 0. Nothing went right for DRX this game. This was exactly what it should have been, quite frankly, with how these two teams have performed over the course of this year. A lot of really good moments from Dplus KIA. I think they went for a really aggressive draft, something that has a lot of options, specifically in the early game, but does have the worry of potentially getting outscaled if things were to become a problem. I think Sylas does help out with that a bit because Sylas can just be so active in the mid game. It actually does relatively well into Talia to be able to move around the map, obviously, but you're really relying on your Xayah and your Renekton and your Rel to be able to create a lot of action, and luckily for DK, they were the better team, and they were able to create a lot of that action, but I could see a world in which this doesn't go nearly as well, and they end up getting outscaled. Luckily, that's not the circumstance they live in. DRX went for a lot of comfort. On the other side here, Paddock has really been going for a lot of Zeri, especially recently. Rascal has always liked the Aatrox pick in the top lane. Krako going for something like Maokai. That's been a big pick for them down the stretch. Just a lot of things that they've shown off. It's just not enough. They're not nearly as good of a team, and I think that that was definitely on display here. Player of the game for me in game 1 is going to go to Deft in the bot lane on this Xayah. Really good performance from Deft. He has been by far the most consistent member of DK over the course of this year. I'm really high on what Showmaker has been able to do, and I also really like Kana. I think Kana has been an incredibly underrated piece for what DK has done in the top lane, considering there really haven't been a lot of elite level top laners in the LCK. I think Kana does a really good job of taking down the top laners that aren't nearly as good, which we'll talk about in a second, but Deft and Kellen have really been the rocks. I shouldn't say Deft and Kellen because sometimes it was Deft and Bible, but I think Deft really has been a rock for this team. He was in my all-pro teams. He was 3rd team all-pro for me, and I think he deserved it. He's been really, really solid. I think this is almost the opposite of what he was for DRX last year, which is even more impressive to me, is the fact that he's really been able to control a lot of early laning phases. He's been someone that when the team does decide to play through him can be a major positive. Remember, for DRX last year, he was almost exclusively weak side. He never got any attention in the early game, and that helped out that team a ton because Kingen and Zeka really wanted a lot of that attention. On DK here, I think he is the one getting a lot of the attention, and he's still doing really well on it. So really good stuff from Deft. Kellen Kellen is still in here, played the playoff series, and he looked okay in that series. I certainly don't think it was entirely his fault that they lost that, but I agree with the decision to keep rolling with him. I think he's a better player than Bible is right now, and I think he's proven that over the course of this split. He was really good in this game number 1. Zaya Rakan is so strong at the moment, and we saw that. Canyon was fantastic on Rel. This is the kind of Rel performance that you need to have in the early game in order to make that champion work nearly as much over the back half of the game, and then Kana and Showmaker both just dominated their laning phases. This game was out of control for DK very quickly, and a lot of that just has to do with the fact that they were just outskilling everybody that they were playing against. And then for DRX on the other side, this was a disastrous game number 1. Basically, everything that could go wrong went wrong. It was honestly kind of difficult to try and determine a dud of the game for game number 1 because everybody played bad. I think that there were moments where players like Paddock didn't necessarily play awful, especially down the stretch, but there's only so much he can do on a champion like Zeri. I think Rascal was miserable this game. I think Fate's scoreline is much better than how he played. I think he was really bad on Talia. But dud of the game for me is going to go to Beryl in the support position. Funny that I'm giving player of the game to Deft and dud of the game to Beryl, considering last year, but Beryl did not have a good game here in game number 1. Now, Beryl has been somebody who has stepped it up when games matter more over the course of his career. He's been a, kind of a notorious regular season underperformer, if you will. He certainly was last year, and he again was this year, but I don't think I have nearly as much confidence that he's going to be able to turn it around like he did in 2022. I think that Beryl has honestly just been one of the worst players in the LCK in 2022, and I think that that would probably continue. Like I said, Fate, not very good on the Talia. Rascal was really bad on the Aatrox, got destroyed in lane, and basically had no impact outside of that. Krako got completely out-jungled, and the minute that he lost pressure, the game was over, and then, like I said, only so much Paddock can do in that bot lane. I do think DRX has potential to maybe win a game in this series, but game number 1 was, like, atrocious, and if they want to not get completely ousted, like, they gotta win soon. I think game 2 is going to be a big game for them confidence-wise, but DK could take a really, really big advantage in this series by winning this game 2 and really putting their foot on the gas. So are they going to be able to do that, or is DRX going to be able to tie up the series? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they're in a pretty commanding spot now. Now, I will say this was a little bit closer than game number 1 was. I think game 1 was obviously such a blowout that I was getting worried that we were going to get 2 kind of dud series in the first round here of the regional finals. This one was at least a little bit more back and forth. Definitely was still in favor of DK basically the entire game, and it's very clear who the better team is in this series through the first 2 games at the very least, but I think DRX did try to put up a little bit more of a fight. We'll get into that when we get into them, but just looking at the 2 comps a little bit first and foremost, you already know how I feel about the DRX comp. You already know I don't like it because look at it. It's all of the traps that I warn teams about falling into, especially LCK teams that have fallen into these so often. A 0+Zeri can work, but you have to have some level of proactivity in the early and especially in the mid game in your jungle or your support position. Probably both, and well, I do think you could make the argument that you have that with Nocturne and Leona. The problem is that both of those champions are so weak in terms of numbers that it just doesn't really add up. Like, again, I get people really like Nocturne, but I just don't. I don't think Nocturne's very good. I'm very low on the pick. I'm very vocal about that. I think it's very much a bait. We'll talk about why I ironically think this is probably best case scenario game for Nocturne in a little bit, but I think Dplus just has so many more options for how they want to play the game out. Rel in particular, I think, already does so much against DRX, a comp that outside of Zeri has very little ability to stop hard engage. You're looking at Malphite potentially re-engaging and Leona being stuck back for peel, but outside of that, like, Azir doesn't really have a lot of ways to self-peel a Rel after she lands. Certainly, Nocturne's not going to do that. Zeri needs Leona in order to do that, and so you don't really have a ton of options here if Canyon plays well, and that ended up being a problem. We'll talk about that. Kellen was also fantastic in this game, but player of the game for me is going to go to Showmaker in the mid lane. Thought he was the most impactful carry this game on the Sylas. That's 2 games of Sylas for him in this series. I'm not sure if it's because he thinks it's strong or if it's just like a champion that he likes to play. Obviously, they've got the Malphite on the other side of the map. I think that's going to be a big reasoning behind picking this, but 2 games in a row is certainly intriguing, and I think in general, there is some untapped potential with what Sylas offers as a mid laner in the current meta. I think comparatively to what a lot of other teams are just picking, like AFK, Azir, especially in the LCK, but Tristana, Jace, Nico, things like that. I think Sylas is actually really good into a lot of those champions, and I think can do quite a bit. Obviously, his numbers aren't in the best spot in the entire world, but I don't think counting out Sylas as a champion right now is smart, and Showmaker showed that off here in game number 2. Showmaker Showmaker's been incredibly underrated all year long. He was arguably the best mid laner in the entire region through the first, like, 3 or 4 weeks of the season. Was a big MVP candidate for me. Obviously didn't finish nearly as strong, didn't even get in my all-pro voting, but that's more so to do with the fact that I think that there were 4 phenomenal mid laners than it does Showmaker playing bad, but he continues to show up when they need him, and I think that this game was another good example of that. I think Kellen was fantastic. Like I said earlier, I think the Alistar was actually way more influential than people are going to give him credit for. I think Kellen and Canyon were very, very active on the map, and a big reason why this team started to pull away in the mid game was because that Rel and that Alistar really didn't have good answers on the side of DRX. Their comp really relies on them having an advantage so that they can go in. That's what you want to do with Leona, Malphite, and Nocturne, but the problem is, if you're DRX, you're not the better team. You're not going to have a lot of advantages, and you're not going to have the ability to go in because you're losing lane early. You're not putting yourself in good positions, and so you're really looking at a comp that doesn't really accomplish all that much, and I think the Alistar and the Rel in particular as champions really started to take advantage of that as the game went on. But Showmaker was the main carry. Kana continues to be really strong up on the top side. Deft was more than good enough on the Aphelios in the bot lane. Just in general, DK kind of dominated this one. And then for DRX, I've already kind of outlined why I think they struggled so much, especially in the mid game here, because this team does rely a ton on being able to be the ones to pull the trigger, be the ones to go in and engage, and when you don't necessarily have that possibility, when you have to play like a front-to-back style with Nocturne and with Malphite and with Leona, and you're having to play into a Sylas, it's a major issue for the team because you don't really have a lot of the buttons that DK does in this game, and I think that became an issue. Krako, ironically enough, was probably the one that was creating the most action on the map, and like I said earlier, I actually do kind of think this was a best-case scenario for Nocturne. I think this champion is really bad, but what Krako did in this game was, you know, he pressed R, he went in, and he got his kill, and that's what Nocturne does. He's going to press R, he's going to go in, he's going to get his kill. You know, hopefully you get out, hopefully you're able to get the kill on a priority target, but sometimes you're not. Sometimes you have to trade 1 for 1. I think for the most part, Krako was still good in this game. The problem was nobody else on this team really even showed up. The bot lane in particular was horrendous, just like they were in game number 1, quite frankly. Dud of the game is going to go to Paddock on this Zeri. Really bad game from the Zeri, consistently getting caught out by Rel, consistently getting caught out by Alistar. The Sylas was a major problem for the Zeri to have to deal with. Just in general, I think Paddock's positioning in this game was pretty poor. This was kind of a bad game in the style of what Paddock has been doing over the course of this year. I don't think he's a bad player. I just think that he's way too over-aggressive, especially in terms of his late-game front-to-back positioning. I think if he was a little bit safer, maybe he could have done a bit of damage. I don't think it actually changes the game too much, but him throwing away a lot of, like, advantages that Zeri has as a champion by just being a little bit too aggro, I think was definitely a major problem for DRX. But Rascal had another really bad game, as he's had for a while. Beryl played Leona very poorly from behind. Fate did a lot of damage, but how much of it was really all that consequential? And, you know, Krako was fine, I guess. But in general, DRX doesn't really feel like they can compete. They don't feel like a team that is even remotely on the same level as a team like DK. And it's very obvious, honestly, to watch. So hopefully they can at least pull out one game here, but they're going to have to do it now because game number 3 is do or die for them. If they lose it, their 2023 season is over. If DK can win it, they're going to be moving on to face Hanwha Life Esports in that final matchup. So are we going to get that in game number 3, or is DRX going to keep this series alive for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series in a clean sweep, and they're going to be moving on to take on Hanwha Life Esports for that final world spot. I know we all kind of expected this again going into this series, which is what I said about the previous one, but this one was arguably even more dominant. I mean, hell, they pulled out Zac in game number 3, and they dominated. Like, nothing against Zac. I actually think Zac's a really good champion. Maybe not a really good, but, like, playable, certainly in the jungle. I think he's better than Nocturne right now, and I think that there were certainly some positives towards what DK was able to do with that Zac pick, but like, DK dominated. They owned this series, and they were the better team basically from minute 1 all the way to the final minute of game number 3. It's just how it is, and so really good stuff to them. Obviously, job's not done. You got to be able to win one more series, or else all of this was for naught. But for DRX, this does mean the end of the line. Their 2023 season is officially over after this game, and it went out, you know, as you would expect, which is with a whimper. I don't think a lot of people had a ton of expectations for DRX going into this series, going into this tournament. I think some people were holding out hope that maybe the Beryl, like, World's Magic, the World's Mojo would end up activating, and he would get there some way, somehow, but that dream ends up getting dashed with him playing rather poorly throughout this entire series, which we will talk about. But player of the game for me and player of the series here is going to go to Deft in the bot lane. Fantastic performance from Deft. He really stepped up when it mattered the most, and it's kind of just what he's done over the course of his entire pro career. He's been exactly what this team has needed, so really good stuff from him. He was great on the Aphelios here. I think there is a case to be made that Kellen should be player of the game here for game number 3, but Deft is most certainly deserving. He had a really good Aphelios game. I think this was really dominant in terms of the aggression and the positioning that we were able to see from him. They put a lot of resources into him, not only in the early game, but just throughout the entire game, and I think he definitely delivered. But Kellen, I think, was also really active on the map. And honestly, Kellen was phenomenal in this series. I think that he's going to get a little bit undervalued because of how good Deft was. Deft's going to get a lot of the attention, and rightfully so. Deft was really good, but I think Kellen definitely deserves it quite a bit as well. This is one of his better series in quite a long time, and again, I really do believe that Kellen is still a world-class support when he's at his absolute best, and I think this was a world-class kind of performance from this bot lane, which they're going to need, but rest of the team really showed up in that same vein. Obviously, Showmaker was awesome on the Sylas in game number 2, was really good on the Jace here in game number 3. I think that scoreline ends up showing it. We'll talk about, like, Showmaker versus Fate, but I think that's, what, like 20 losses in a row for Fate going into Showmaker. Absolutely absurd. Something that is, like, unparalleled. Maybe it's even more than that, like 30 or something in a row. Showmaker's just dominated Fate in terms of, you know, the 1-to-1, the mid versus mid matchup, and that continued in this series. Showmaker was fantastic the entirety of the 3 games, and then Canyon, really, really aggressive as an engaged threat, whether it's on the Rel, whether it's on the Zac here in game number 3. It was a lot of fun to watch. I like Zac. I actually think Zac is, like, playable right now. I don't think a lot of people are going to share that opinion. I haven't really seen him be discussed all that much as a potential jungle option, but I do think that Zac is certainly someone that gives you everything that you kind of need. If you're not going to be able to get Rel, if you're not going to be able to get, like, you know, Maokai or Sejuani or any of these other, like, hard engage, AoE engage tanks in the jungle, I do think that Zac does fill that role and still plays it relatively well. I don't think he's as good as those other champions, but I do think he is still good at it, and his clear is honestly very underrated, and so I like Zac. I think Canyon showed it off well. Kana was just by far the better top laner across this entire series. Rascal had a very poor series, which again isn't a surprise to me. I know it's probably a surprise to Reddit, who continues to just like hype him up, but Rascal's not had a very good 2023, but in general, DK looked really good. They looked exactly as they should have. They dominated this series, and they're definitely going to be going into that final series with a ton of momentum. And then for DRX on the other side, not good. I mean, this looked like a team that was 6 games below 500 coming out of the regular season. Like, they did not look like a team that was supposed to be here in the season finals, but that's not entirely surprising if we're being entirely honest, because, again, they're not really all that good. They're really not. Like, the talent on this team never really lived up to the expectation of what we thought they were going to be at the beginning of the year. I think they were lucky to be able to get top 6 and to be able to get here in the first place, and so to see them struggle, at least they got here, right? Dead of the game is going to go to Beryl. I think you could give this to Rascal up in the top lane as well. Both were pretty atrocious. Beryl was really bad on the Maokai again. I've talked about this before on the channel as well, but Maokai support isn't quite the same as Maokai in the jungle. You're not going to be nearly as tanky. You're actually going to be relatively squishy because of that lack of gold. You're not going to be able to build up a lot of those tank stats that you would normally have if you were in the jungle, and so I think a lot of those engages are coming from a place of players who might be, you know, a little bit more used to a little bit more survivability coming out from that champion, and I do think that was a bit of a problem for Beryl, but he was really bad in this series. Paddock really struggled down the stretch in this series. Again, not surprising going into Deft and Kellen, but the DRX bot lane did not hold up. Rascal was really bad across this series. Fate was meh. Krako was meh, right? I don't think they were the big problems. I do think that bot lane was probably the most noticeable issue for DRX, but in general, just did feel like they were outclassed as a team, which again is fine. They weren't supposed to be here in the first place, but that's going to be their 2023 season. I think looking back on it, they're going to consider it a disappointment because I think a lot of people expected them to be a top 6 team pretty easily going into the year, and while they did end up getting there, maybe accidentally throughout the year, it certainly wasn't in the way that they expected, and, you know, them dropping out and getting destroyed so quickly, I think is going to leave a sour taste in some of those players and this org's mouth. But for DK on the other side, the job's not done. Like I said earlier, you still got one more series to win. I think they can do it. It's going to be interesting. We'll preview that in just a second, but congratulations on getting to that spot in the first place. Let's see if some of that magic is still left in them. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Worlds Qualifier Round 1 overview and analysis video. We know our number 3 seed going to Worlds, of course that being KT Rolster, out of the LCK now, but we know our matchup that's going to determine the final team that ends up going as the number 4 seed. It's going to be Hanwha Life Esports taking on Dplus KIA. Certainly an intriguing matchup. We saw Hanwha get destroyed by KT. We saw DK absolutely destroy DRX. I think momentum is certainly on DK's side, but Hanwha Life did beat them in the final week of the regular season just about a month ago, and so definitely some reason to go either way. I think the series is going to be very interesting. It's starting basically as I'm recording this. I think Game 1 draft is happening right now, and so I promise I'm not spoiling anything by giving predictions. I know this will probably come out a little bit after the series is started, or maybe even after it's over. I'll try to get this edited and up as soon as possible, but for Hanwha versus DK, I think the interesting conversation to be had is Canyon versus Grizzly. I think Canyon's going to have a big chip on his shoulder, and if he just plays like Canyon, if he goes out there and just dominates the jungle matchup, I do think DK is just going to be able to win it. Same thing for Showmaker and Dezeka. I think if Showmaker is just straight up the better mid laner, I don't think that there's going to be a lot that Hanwha Life can do to actually win that game relatively easily, and so I think for HLE, they're going to need some other more volatile players to step up, but DK has certainly not been the most consistent team over the course of this year. If you would have asked me Canyon versus Grizzly at the beginning of the year, I would have been like, who's Grizzly? But I would have said Canyon would destroy him, obviously, for obvious reasons, but Grizzly was arguably better than Canyon or more consistent than Canyon down the stretch of the regular season. So I do think there is room for Hanwha to be able to win a series like this, but I'm going to predict DK in their current form to be able to take it. I do think it should be close, but I think I'm going to predict Dplus KIA to be the fourth and final team to represent Korea at the International Tournament, World Championships, yada yada. But I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my predictions down in the comment section below. If you did enjoy, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Worlds is right around the corner. We're going to be doing a ton of coverage, player rankings, team rankings, predictions, yada, 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 everything you want. We've been covering all 4 of the major regions all year long, and so I promise you there's going to be no channel on YouTube that does as in-depth of coverage on all of these teams as what you're going to get here. So if you're interested in that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.